So now we're going to cover a little bit more about respiration in this topic of respiration and circulation. And we've already talked a little bit about modifications that certain animals may have in order to be able to breathe, such as fish. Concentration of oxygen is a lot lower in the water than it would be in the air for us. And things like insects and other arthropods that have holes that where air enters through the sides of their body into trachea, which branch off into tracheals, which is different than us, which we breathe through our mouth and it goes into our lungs, and then there's gas exchange. We have these capillaries, these huge beds of capillaries that just cover the alveoli so that you can get gas exchange in oxygen and carbon dioxide, our waste product. And so the process of breathing is basically ventilation of the lungs. It's an alternating inhalation and exhalation of the air, where you move air in and out of the lungs. And there have been different ways that animals have evolved methods in order to make this work best for the environment that they happen to live in. So an amphibian breathes opposite of the way that we do. They call it a positive pressure breathing, so it forces air down the trachea. Birds have these little air sacs that function as tiny little bellows, and so it's only one direction. Ours is kind of double direction. So we have a two cycle. We have an inhalation and an exhalation. And our breathing is called negative pressure breathing. So it pulls air into the lungs. And it all has to do with what happens with our diaphragm, which causes our lungs to either open up or shrink smaller. So with inhalation, the way that the diaphragm works, or the way that we call it contracting versus relaxing, is kind of opposite of the way that common sense would tell us how it should work. So when we inhale, our diaphragm contracts and it actually moves down, and our lungs open up and fill up, so do our ribs, and air pulls into our body. Exhalation, the diaphragm and the rib cage relaxes and it shrinks, and so air gets forced out of our body. So when we breathe in, our chest is fuller. When we breathe out, our chest becomes smaller. Tidal volume is the volume of air that we inhale with each breath, and the maximum tidal volume is called our vital capacity. After we exhale, there's a residual volume. There's still air that remains there. So we always have fresh air mixed with this oxygen depleted air within our lungs. It's almost, I would say, probably totally impossible to squeeze everything out because our lungs can't shrivel down to absolutely nothing. It's not like totally emptying a balloon. In humans, the main control center for breathing is in the medulla oblongata, which is at the bottom of the base of the brain. So if you're born without a brainstem or without that medulla oblongata, you aren't going to survive once you're born. If there's major trauma to the brain and that the medulla oblongata is damaged, then most likely, unless you get immediate attention, you're not going to be able to survive either, and you're definitely not going to be able to breathe on your own for the rest of your life. And so that medulla, it responds to pH changes in the cerebrospinal fluid, because CO2 is going to alter the pH change, which tells your medulla oblongata it's time to start exhaling. And it's also adjusted to match metabolic demand. So you're running, jogging, exercising, you're obviously going to be breathing a lot harder, and it's the medulla oblongata that tells your lungs to do that because it picks up that you are much more active. So metabolic demands of many organisms require that blood transport large quantities of oxygen and CO2 to, oxygen to our muscles, and then pulling the CO2 out of our muscles, right? Explaining it, then me just repeating that.
Oxygen-poor blood carrying carbon dioxide leaves the tissue capillaries and moves through blood vessels to the heart, where it is pumped to the alveolar capillaries of the lungs. When blood gets to the lungs, hemoglobin gives up its carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions. Bicarbonate combines with hydrogen ions to form carbonic acid, which is then converted back into carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the cell, out of the blood plasma, and into an alveolus in the lungs, where it is expelled with exhaled air.
So if that isn't working properly, obviously we're going to have excess carbon dioxide within our blood or in that kind of plasma area, which is going to cause a lot of issues. Bottom line, and the main point of this is that the carbon dioxide is taken from the blood to the lungs, from the tissue, from your blood, from your tissues. You've exercised, you've made a lot of CO2. The blood takes it from your tissues, muscle or whatever it is, travels down the vessels to the lungs. It's in those little capillary beds, right? Goes to the alveolar space where there's all those capillary beds, and it's going to pick up that CO2 and you exhale it and breathe it out. So that what happens in your lungs is really, really small compared to what's happening throughout all your entire body. There's a lot of CO2 building up in different places, and it's your blood that gets it to your lungs. So respiration and circulation really go hand in hand.
As carbon dioxide is produced by cellular respiration in the cells, it diffuses into the interstitial fluid, through the capillary wall, and into the blood plasma. Some CO2 remains dissolved in the plasma, but most enters red blood cells. Some CO2 combines with hemoglobin. Most of the carbon dioxide, however, reacts with water to form carbonic acid, H2CO3. Carbonic acid breaks up to form a hydrogen ion, H+, and a bicarbonate ion, HCO3-. Hemoglobin picks up most of the hydrogen ions, preventing them from making the blood too acidic. The bicarbonate ions diffuse out of the red blood cell into the plasma. Let's start by looking at the movement of respiratory gases between blood and the body's tissue cells. Oxygen molecules are unloaded from hemoglobin, a protein in red blood cells. Oxygen diffuses into the blood plasma, through the capillary wall, into the interstitial fluid, and into cells, where it is used in cellular respiration. Meanwhile, oxygen from inhaled air diffuses out of the alveolus, into the blood plasma, and into the red blood cell, where it combines with hemoglobin. Oxygen-rich blood then leaves the alveolar capillaries and travels to the heart, where it is pumped through blood vessels to tissue capillaries. There, red blood cells deliver oxygen to tissue cells.
Okay, so this little section is about respiratory pigments, which are respiratory pigments are pigments that circulate around in your blood, or the hemolymph. If you're not a mammal, you're like an arthropod, like an insect, they have hemolymph, and it increases the amount of oxygen that can be transported. So they're important in allowing us to uh, gain more oxygen more efficiently. And usually it's like a metal bound to a protein. Because that metal generally has a negative or a positive charge so that it can grab onto that oxygen. So respiratory pigment of almost all vertebrates and many invertebrates is called hemoglobin. And if it's a metal, then what metal do you think it's probably made up of? Well, iron, right? When you hear about having low iron in your blood. So a single hemoglobin molecule can carry 4 molecules of oxygen and 1 molecule for each iron-containing heme group. Hemoglobin binds oxygen reversibly, which means that it's able to get rid of it. It's not bound to it and then it's permanent. So loading it in the gills or the lungs and releasing it in other parts of the body. And so this idea that hemoglobin binds oxygen cooperatively just really means that when oxygen binds to one portion of it, the others change shape so that they want to grab onto oxygen more so. And when they release oxygen, the others become bound to oxygen more readily. So it's cooperative in that it works together. The more oxygen, it's almost that the more oxygen is bound, the more it's almost like a positive feedback where the Hemoglobin is going to bind to more and more oxygen once it grabs onto that first one. So this Bohr shift basically happens when carbon dioxide is produced during cellular respiration. It lowers the blood pH, so you're exercising, you're producing a lot of CO2, lowers the blood pH and decreases the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. So hemoglobin also assists in preventing harmful changes in blood pH. So it plays a minor role in CO2 transport through this Bohr shift, but its main role, hemoglobin's main role, is to gain oxygen and carry it along throughout the body. So most CO2 from respiring cells, cells that are giving off CO2, right, diffuse into the blood, and they're transported in the blood plasma, and they bind to those bicarbonate ions, and so we get rid of it, and you saw that in those videos just a minute ago.